If you love scary stories that give you goosebumps, subscribe to the channel and join our chilling Dark Whispers squad. Don't forget to drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Let's start. The forest that was once full of life and gave us the pleasure and freedom, but was later leveled to the ground, had a surprise for us when we could freely go to the ground we isolated from. We went there, and we were fascinated by the presence of the elevators. And at the same time, the hill had the god of the mountain church, which on the dock on the lake with their company books look as these parts of rescuers. Like the moon when the church was left the entrance, a very old church was instantly noticed. We didn't notice it before. It looked like it was waiting for something to come. It was the church under Chicago, so in reality, it was a ghost town. However, the old freight tunnels here were mainly shut down for years. Hence, the Chicago post office was extremely large. It remained a ghost town for a long time, until only a few people who reside in the outskirts of the city went to restaurants. Old Cook County Hospital, previously a spooky place straight out of the movie Silent Hill, and now a hotel in the making. Also, we explored more of the latest places that we had never been to before. And once we were told about the MCA Hall, somewhere deep in the sparsely populated Buckhorn area of Iowa during the 1900s. Buckhorn was the center of countless money exchanges because it was linked to Glasgow by the railroad. But the local industry only started to produce a few hundreds of tons of butter weekly, and most people worked in that company. But when it saturated, there was such a severe increase in costs that the Durham ceased operating, and the town suddenly found itself out of work even to one person a day. 44s, and the people just went out of there one family at a time. By the 80s-90s, the town was just completely vacant, even though we had some online research looking for information, mostly from Herbeck's forums, where people would exchange their experiences, and we also planned to visit some places. The fact that we had no doubts about the old Creary W floor which caught on to us was one of the most beautiful and mystical places we could have come across. Using such as an advantage was the 4-hour trip, but also the only disadvantage we had. It was also October, so we woke up early and drove out of town so we could cover all the spots we had listed in time. One early morning in November, we took off by loading up Mike's old van and drove down Highway 64 towards the Iowa state line. It was really lousy weather. Being the first cold gray Saturday one could have imagined, and I would rather just stay in bed. And honestly, Herc, when it is such weather, good feels very odd. And in this kind of weather, the place just looks rather meaningless. Also, the thought of going to a neighboring land kept us very enthused, and that is why we did not mind the malfunctioning heating in Mike's truck. Each of us, however, dressed in Arctic gear, was very unconcerned about the cold as we approached Buckhorn in the van. We were highly exhilarated and feeling anticipatory emotions when we set out for our first trip. Although when we finally landed in the town, it was simply everything one could possibly visualize. Turniston was a place which time stopped together, for indeed no soul was to be seen while nature took over. The feeling of the buildings being totally empty and deserted left us shivering a bit. Some of them appeared as if they were set up to deceive, so that one moment it might not be unreasonable to collapse, and weed was growing everywhere over the streets. Nothing but the sound of the leaves and the noiseless time marked in the region were the only sounds that played back. Indeed, the eerie feeling we got from the abandoned schoolhouse can only be matched by a building. This is falling apart. Already from the rain, it rained in one of the wormy corners earlier. This was also a reason for the wetness the previous days had. It was clear from yonder that some of the ceilings were leaky, while the rest of the place, the thought of the floor falling down was still very far from me that I could dare to be uncomfortable, even when I saw that one warning message on the smartboard. Mike made fun of the message in the first place, and then, by using the classroom in question as a gesture, He imitated what the word warning meant on the board, just to illustrate where we were supposed to go. Mike greeted us on arrival and showed the message to us, and we all had a little laugh as we all have witnessed these spooky Grifflins, Herbert, and others. It almost always is more intriguing than the danger sign that says "come to us" by a wizard. We read all the official-looking signs and warnings about unstable structures or active power cables along the way, but when it comes to stuff like deserted hope, all the people who go down here or Pennywise this layer with an exception, you're not inclined to take it seriously. And we were of the opinion that the danger on the blackboard was totally another herder's tag, like a disconcerting manner to say that I got here first, but later on, we came to a realization that the graffiti was indeed a lot more important than first we thought. We proceeded to the other classrooms to check the chalkboards for more messages, but there was none, and I know that the dust was so thick and it was all over the desk, and Mike could not help but to playfully chase us around and tell us that he was going to wipe that grime on one of our jackets. And it was then that I first realized that our friend Tom was acting weird. He was usually the most excited of us. His camera was always ready, his inquisitiveness incomplete. However, that day he was distant, and moreover, a rush of adrenaline surged through Daz as he approached it, and the time Mike noticed him, he was now talking about something boring, just like he used to do. Still, when something on Mike's finger caught his attention, he moved away from the bitter joke and chose not to say anything harsh to Mike. Instead, he just signaled it was time to go, and we needed to leave the place. The shelves still had cans on them, and the brand names we had never seen before were also hanging there. The cans had deteriorated so much that it was difficult for us to recognize any of the names. Besides, Tommy, who had been previously our best friend in the world, had not been in a particularly empathic state while we were strolling through the aisles. Besides, at Old Town Hall, where his actions often were entertainment, were his acts as well. He gave us the impression that he was a joker friend when someone between us was in fact a stand-up comedian. Yet his eyes were wide open, asking for more, whatever he wanted to know, as if the secrets were known to him too. Then Tommy suddenly raised his hand as blood was gushing from his nose, and he began to pinch his nose, and blood began to pour out as heavy as pitch, to the point his arms were the color of the night. He informed me that he was feeling so scared after my help, but regardless, he went on to say, "You idiot, leave me alone," which was a clear sign that he was still alive. One of us even conjectured if Tommy was all right. Consequently, not only was he sure that the blood of his nose was in full flow, but also the reason for him being angry with me was that while I wanted to go home just for his bleed, the one I suggested was not enough to set him off. Our statement that this excursion had almost ended in disaster, and maybe the girl one of us picked to be left with her group if she decided to stay and not help us anymore, broke new ground, which he rejected and suggested we go back just as far as the ear needle had been stuck, as we saw there only Tom had got along with us. Thus, the group split, and I wandered to the old sheriff's office, led by the old location that looked much like the reception area. Down the hall in the rear of the office, I had the impression that I was walking next to the cells, though it could hardly have been seen with the naked eye. I headed towards the reception area one more time, and suddenly, I found it big, bold, freshly painted black words. With what looked like a spray paint were the words, "If you bleed, leave Buckhorn and never return." That was truly astonishing. I was completely shaken when I saw that, and straight away called the others to act immediately. I informed them that we had to get out of the place, but once again, Tommy was to such an extent with the outgoing, so I started by giving to the others my flags, saying the one on the wall of the sheriff's office, but it was still a very delicate process, till Mike and the rest moved here, listening more or less. So I got some of the words out till Tommy just started shouting something like, "How many times do I have to tell you we're not leaving okay?" And again, he moved. towards me, still yelling. The crowd jumped in to hold him back, thinking that he was going to hit me, so we were able to calm him down, and it partly looked like it. Initially it was so then, however. Later on, during the time of reflection, I puzzled. That's when that just fatigue set in. We carried almost the whole way back Tommy to the van. Sometime later, he quit fighting, and because we thought he was seriously ill, we gave him a ride to the hospital. He just wanted to go home. The drive back was, however, all the time, silence and genuine nervousness. Tommy displayed somewhat improving as he looked very poorly, and his breathing was not deep at the very beginning. When we entered the street, he fainted. Then his body just slumped against the back seat, and the only part of him that was conscious was the only part of him that was alive. We tried to talk to him and slapped him to wake him up. Once we were back in the city, we saw Tommy. However, he was in such a state that he was really out of it, despite the fact that both Rose and her daughter were still staying with him after we convinced them that he was telling the truth. The moment we arrived, he was so solid still, no matter the fact that his celebrity had disappeared. His current condition was the only thing that mattered. We expected Tommy to answer us with 2 words and then again fall into a very deep sleep. He really seemed to be a little beside himself, so we decided to leave him in peace. The long sentence with more than 50 words indicates that it has passed the limit of 15 words, and so we should be more careful to choose the words. Also, the whole thing involved his mom and sister when we convinced them the whole story, but we were all so terrified to the core of the reality that the warning was written on the wall, the blood on the nose, and the horror on Tommy's face were all just like a movie that was playing in my head all over and over again. And although I was lying in bed that night, I couldn't remove that small feeling of anxiety from me. The platoon doctor had seen why Tommy reacted to the situation that way, and what was it either in or about Buckhorn that made him act like that. The police department's admonition was very clear, but the outcomes were just awful. Was it some kind of toxic contamination, and if so, why was it? Only that Tommy was the one affected this way? The thoughts of the Yarns people had told me about Buckhorn occurred to me. They spoke of the hidden opportunities that were there in the active town, which later dwindled due to the reason no one could ever catch. Additionally, I had gone through about the closing of Creary and realized that the articles never mentioned that the Creary closed, and I wondered why that was the case. A few mentioned the economic downfall, but there was no mention of a cryptic illness or any other kind of incoherent incidents that made the company go. Then I turned to his court, but I had no records of the record industries that could have given Tommy the condition he had, nor did I think of the existent one. The city and Tommy were at the place, and he was completely bombed out. He was completely oblivious to it. He didn't change at all. Only basic life signs that kept him alive when we broke into his apartment. Tommy was acting like a person who had just woken up from a deep sleep. He was a little bit confused, and we let him rest for a while, without causing any problems for him. The long synthetic sentence is too long. It is extremely long. We can choose words from it very carefully, and have only very personal and his family and his mom to stay with him with us, telling them all events to his best knowledge. But we were all petrified of our lives at that moment. The alarm that went off on the wall, the sight of blood on the nose, and the panic in Tommy's eyes were all vivid images in my mind. And even while lying in my bed that night, I did not feel peaceful. I'd figured out why Tommy was so disturbed and what had been the thing that upset him. It was quite clear that the notice by the police department was explicit, but the results were just a nightmare. How could it be that some chemical exposure triggered only Tommy to respond the way he did? I tried to concentrate on the narratives of Buckhorn, the town of legends, a place of endurance that once had its good days. But then it was like the process of dying could never be thoroughly understood, that said, I had seen a piece on the turning of the Creary. Now, even I realized why no reference was made to any disruptions of the Creary's operation. In any post I had read, some stated, such as the sole reason for the shutdown of the company, about the economic slump, but it was both the secrecy and the uncertainty that were bigger culprits causing the big head to have the question mark. The next day I was scanning the material, but there was nothing to find that would somewhat enhance the understanding of what happened to him. There was no record of a mishap at any factory. Neither was there any unusual case of any other component suspected by a layman to have caused his situation. Thus, the thought I had in mind was it just industrial contamination. Cliffs will be the one held the demons. The only way we found out about the symptoms at all was when we saw him laying on the floor after rolling him over, so looking kind of like a wet fish from the gym locker room. We had to make an emergency call to 911, and then we kind of took care of the wound before we went to the hospital. Besides the clothes covered with blood, we used to clean up the place where it hurt too much and exchanged it with a fear of a loopy lightness by turning around in circle and wondering what in the hell was happening to Tom, Jerry, and the others. I am not skilled in writing, but wrote this out because it might help someone else. If you ever get wind of Buckhorn and someone wants to go there, for a reason, just put a distance between yourself and that place. If you value your life, which is more than just a simple ghost story, it is more of a real entity rather than a ghost. This entity can really hurt you, mind control you, or hurt yourself. My friend who was the most affected one is healed, but I think you might be held accountable and have to exhume whatever lives the place hides, what seems like memories from the distant past. I chose to go and see one friend who moved to San Francisco only recently. I had to drive myself. It was more than 1,000 miles from the place I was to the place I was going to. I planned to start at 3 in the morning and go through Utah by day, stay over at the Holiday Inn in a little town called Ely, Nevada for the night. And then I left and arrived at San Fran the next morning after a big breakfast and a night of good sleep. The car broke down on the way. I arrived on time and in one piece to the last event that was the closing one of the trip, but that did not go as well as I expected. You might be laughing, but I really have never been to Utah before. The trip to San Francisco, the distance from Monroe to San Fran, is less than 100 miles, but if I went out of town, it was to go to Boulder or to Denver perhaps. I knew the eastern parts of the state could be quite deserted, but nothing prepared me for Utah by the time the car had gotten to Delta. In such a place, outside the desert, a futuristic vehicle zoomed through the horizon. The journey seemed to be unending, with a duration of 1.5 between 30 to 60 minutes. After I had left Delta, I grasped my error for not filling the gas when I had the chance to, and the moment I observed my gas gauge approaching an empty tank, I was in a state of confusion and drank alcohol. The last thing on my mind was that I may have been stuck in a town that I am not familiar with, and it is very obvious that I was relieved when I saw the sign. It was the only sign of life that I had spotted. Immediately after my departure from Delta, the only sign of a gas station on the highway was a lonely one which said, "Last chance gas 5 miles." I thought to myself, I wish God know that I am really a believer. But instead of that, like a couple of minutes later, I saw what looked like a small town formation there on the horizon. It was enough to practice hanging at the exit of the highway, which was the main one, and an area of failed houses, mingled with the sight of cheerless leaves, dirty from the paint coming off, and with some of their windows broken. In addition to all this, my companion's degree of amusement made me merry too. When I got to the station, the stress of my tires was hard to tell as my feet crunched under the tires while I was parking, and the pump stood quiet, and still no cars and no sign of life from the tiny store attached to the station. When I turned the engine off, I was surprised by the silence. This little place allowed me. This view was going in a circle. I thought the town was worse than sleeping, or people mentioned a slow town desert, but for me, it was the best thing that happened in this week. If this village would be in sound sleep, I would be very pleased. Instead of it being in coma, I went to the gas pump door in a manner of curiosity, and I took a closer look at it, and I noticed it was one of the models that have nowadays, not anymore. And as long as the nozzle seemed to be heavy, it hardly could last for more than several months itself. As I looked at it, the queue of cars seemed to be endless, and it was not my lucky day as the gas pump kept on failing to allow gasoline to flow when I tried to fill it up. I tried to shake and tap the pump at the station in the hope that it would fix the problem, but I was not successful. I concluded it must be an empty gas pump since it literally contained nothing, and I was contemplating that perhaps doing something more productive like asking an attendant would have been better when I went to an old gas station to ask help. The door creaked so loudly when I opened it, and I had to maneuver past it just to get in and out. The bell sounded so loudly, and the place looked extremely dilapidated. Most of the snacks on the shelves were vintage, such as those bright, colorful candies from the decades ago, and the cash register was also from another time, one of those heavy metallic kinds with large only buttons, and the posters on the walls were so faded over the years. From advertising the movies and events of 2001, they looked as if they were all downloaded in that year, and as far as I am aware, I only came one day in this fall. It was in 2009. I called out hello, but my voice only echoed back at me, and no one seemed to respond at the counter. There was an old newspaper from 8 years ago that mentioned a festival, and the calendar behind the counter was stuck on the same date as that newspaper, still showing June 2001. And that's when I began to feel deeply unsettled. I went to check the back room, and then the door was opened a little and there was more of the same. A cup with old dried coffee remains at the bottom, clothes still hanging on the back of a chair, and the radio was switched on, but it was silent. I also found a ledger with the last entry dated the same day as the newspaper, and somehow everyone in town just disappeared quite a few. It was on that day when I came out of the back room, and through the window I understood that the empty swings appeared to be swaying softly in the wind on the playground across the street. But the absence of the children or adults, let alone the silence around it, were still paying too much of a price. I smelled something burning. I could not resist the temptation. My curiosity was driving me into the burning house, and I was never scared as I should have been. Then, being upset and yearning to be a bit more daring, I toured the whole place leisurely and said good night to everybody. In a straw, I visited every room and almost tried a door, but all of them were locked. Walking around, one thought struck me. Hank had died and had been alone until I had found him. The rooms were dusty, filthy, and covered with soot, as if no one had been there for a long time at all. The atmosphere that I had felt in visiting houses, not only invisible or not invasive, but also, I felt like a scavenger reflecting on nuclear disasters. In one of the houses, the door was open just a little, and the inside was 3 times more than that. I discovered a book on the couch that had a dried-out rim and another book on the coffee table. The little boy's room upstairs had toys all over the room, which gave it the appearance of having been left mid-play and then abandoned forever. That one of them is threefold, and the door is open almost as if some person went out to get something and, in less than a minute, returned so they might want to leave again another time. The door was open a bit, and I could see a person's head in the living room. I have to admit that I did what I should not have done, but I had to know, and I left, but then I entered the room that scared the hell out of me. I know that this is not right, but I just had to see it. So I backed off that kid's room, which always is a little bit scary for me. The third one has me thinking, why did I ever enter a complete stranger's house? Now I held on to my head, barely remembering how foolish I behaved as I entered this place without spotting my friends. I also wondered how a person who is obviously in heavy denial of the truth can be so damn funny. Not only that, but the mind can also be very crafty and can even go to the extent of imagining a situation that might have occurred. You know what, man, I just as much as I'm concerned that something so bad had happened to these people could be somewhat true. I should have known. Should the nightmares of many people visiting this site hold any truth, then I, too, am in great danger, and just like them, I need to get out of here as soon as possible. I was feeling the time was not on my side, but still, the fear that someone could be watching me was bothering me. Even though I was pretty much sure that there wasn't anybody in the vicinity, I felt something wrong as I got into the car, and I felt like the best thing to do was to leave. That place was deserted even when I was 99% sure that I was all alone. I still felt as if someone was out there. I hopped in my car, tried to think of solutions to the situation, but there was no signal, and thus I resorted to listening to the radio. Its signal was really weak there. I assume it was a dead zone while I was sitting in the car. I was hoping that I would get it to start and move, but my overriding emotion was one of being afraid that I would be stuck in the middle of nowhere with no gasoline. He left. However, in my moment of panic and horror, I just brushed off the thought of it and decided to turn over the engine so quickly that I would be out of there already. So even though it was foolish, I was let down because I was thinking I would not be having a car issue in the spookiest places twice. But luckily, I was able to find a gas station just over the state line where I could cross and reach Ellie. By the time I pulled into Chevron, I was not joking when I told them my car had no gas. Anyway, in like a split second, lo and behold, my phone was up and running. Just like that, as I was filling the tank, I suddenly had a full signal. Today, we almost never see them at the gas station. However, in the past, so many signs all around that station would say that the use of cell phones while pumping gas was blocked by the road. I actually went inside to inquire if I could use their phone in place when I was feeling the situation was not in my favor, or if they could tell me about that abandoned town. I guess the on-duty clerk would make me feel included, albeit not allowing it to be too far, and be asked nothing, along with the usual fact that in the clerk at the sheriff's office, he was quite the working type. At the same time, the deputy sheriff was really positive that he was right. When I got back on the line with Utah, some crickets seemed to find the gas station attendant so to the point and knowledgeable that he asked only if I had passed by the gas station. Before starting the project, I had realized the strength of the location, yet I was beyond thrilled when he allowed me to use it. Ever since humans have deserted the place, it has been an historical attraction for the people of this area. I was thrilled to the core, as it could be indeed a new start for us. Besides, the next step was winning over some people to assist in the small things whenever I was away. Just when my boss announced that one of my colleagues and I had to do some minor repairs to the job we did, so I was setting up my travel to the destination of my project. My understanding is that there is no proof of human activity taking place. When it came to connection with natural forces, I was neither talented nor gifted, so it was more just like doing job whipping on me, as this was just a taste. After all, Millburg was the town which is in close proximity to my house, and the time spent there was indeed a trigger to a lot of feelings. It's been so long since the days when St. Jerome. Let me talk about the place. In the first place, perhaps, most of the attractions in the town would be of this kind. In other words, I was somewhat like how much I will be an ornament. To the contrary, I have become so much reflective of my actions up to this moment that I think I am not fulfilling the task of giving the project serious attention. This looks the same as the one you had been here for in the previous week. Still, the situation will have been better than the last one. In fact, I remember that a company originally was assigned to the town for Millburg. Besides, the very first action would be that the movie will be conceived in our town. And so at that time, it is no surprise that I also know quite a few small suppliers which I hired. Office over in Fillmore, and not speak about his visits to the office by means of phone calls, but visits were the main way now. As a precaution, call me paranoia. But I reckon it was a sort of a reminder, or something. I think he hoped I wouldn't come to meet him at the office to discuss this. And he was quite right, because I didn't. I kept going on towards San Francisco and was just an hour or so later than I was supposed to be. So like I started with, I arrived in good time and without mishaps, but it was on my mind almost obsessively for all. Tell the truth, there were already a mystery I'd visited, and I, who I'd driven with out there to see, had a long talk about it. Still, I was haunted by the question my friends and I had about the supernatural happening there near the big wheel and everything along the street, that my being the main driver was interrogated as the missing link in the case is that the right authorities are eager to work on it. No wonder the deputy sheriff was cautious of reporters. He'd probably been burned in the past after some loose talk made it into the papers. And my friend thought it was basically a case of my imagination getting the better of me after having stopped somewhere that I shouldn't have. I mentioned the fact that if I have stopped in Delta for gas like I was supposed to, I'd have just rolled through Millburg like it was any other town, and it wouldn't have been on my mind like it was. My friend then told me to live in that reality, pretend that I'd never even seen Millburg. Because when it comes to events where whole towns disappear, sometimes ignorance truly is bliss that helped me keep Millburg off my mind for a couple of days. I had to return to reality and face the problem. Post our journey, I had to come back on the same route. First of all, I assumed that I should have gone the main road and visit my friend who is a Fillmore deputy sheriff. However, when I got to the gas station after my friend reminded me about that, I decided to avoid Millburg, another car driver, who swished towards the direction of a four-way crossing for a couple of seconds without looking back during the time when he passed us in the opposite lane. The inquiry was conducted by the South Australia Police Department on May 20, 1999, in response to the disappearance of some local residents from a certain Adelaide suburb. To begin with, the police officers headed towards Snowtown, where they had the first contact with the residents. It was 80 miles north of their location, which was Snowtown, the small village with a population of about 300. At the old bank of Yieldless Futures in First Saint, the officers wanted to thoroughly search the vault, but the task was more than they expected. Therefore, two officers had to drive their cruiser through the country's highways for hours and park it at the empty bank. Once inside the building, which was locked, and having prepared their flashlights, the two officers marched straight into the dark and dusty hallways. They reached the vault after entering it. The officers noticed the entrance to the large steel door was slightly open. Then they pushed it further to enter and found a half-dozen large plastic barrels. The policemen might have had their doubts, yet to be sure, one of them got bolder and went closer to one of the barrels to unseal it a little, which was extremely odorous. The whole of the Australian Media Authority only wrote about 8 human bodies who were left out of the total of 6 plastic drums, and the whole circumstance was kept quiet. Initially, the village of Snowtown was an isolated place, but it became a high-crime area that attracted attention countrywide, and all were so taken aback that they demanded a steep and immediate punishment to the culprit. Nevertheless, this was not the total truth that the authorities told them. The law enforcement had been trying to solve 5 years' worth of intriguing disappearance cases, and as such, they had discovered that a man named John Bunting was the leading suspect. The 4th of September, 1966, is the day when John was born, and the place was Narla, a small town located in Queensland, which was highly remote. Not even his family or the local state social services knew that his parents ever killed or abused him before he was 5 years of age, but he was until the 8th grade attending school. His school was taking care of him, as his parents' presence or their absence did not matter in his childhood until the 3rd school year, when the boy's life was completely shattered with the help of Johnny. One day when he was just 8 years old, he was having a nap at the neighbor's house and was caught with his friend's older brother, and both were sent out while the others enjoyed playing indoors. He was then a party to the group of boys at that time, and he also got beaten, and for the same reason, the one that was older than him became the man who raped him. This event made him hate gay men, and he threw the whole surprisingly idea at them, as well as at pedophiles who he assumed to be. The photography career where he was most obsessed with composition was his teen part. He was also fascinated by human anatomy in a bad way, and the high excellence of the student was not very high, as the downside was that he was only the normal elements of the study area that were happening to him except by himself, that he set a cannon off on the most unexpected body parts. To begin from the zero basis, Bunting was embroiled in a conflict when he was 22 years old and angrily pleaded guilty to crimes of assault. He was hired at a Queensland abattoir, and by working hard, he was also promoted to a position where he was the one of the workers who took pleasure in the slaughterhouse types of housing at the abattoir, which represented the year 1991. A 25-year-old Bunting would be established in the Adelaide suburb of Salisbury, where two women at once, Robert Joe Wagner and the 33-year-old Bronze Ray Hayden, would become his fiancées. They were all to be married. This he had was also used by him to make even others act and think the same way, which he did. He displayed a strong psycho-astronomical idealism. Moreover, he was a highly dominant figure and suffered the leadership roles with the greatest gust of wind. Most of them attended sessions in a desperate mood, looking at the leaders of his meetings whose faces and words were filled with sympathy. He takes it up a notch by telling he would be joining, while one of the two was getting rid of their bad personalities. Then the other one was gradually developing such great qualities as altruistic compassion in the near future. Bunting set a very small, including very loyal circle of people with a hatred towards social outcasts who were selective, except for a few people with common likes, such as disliking of the pedophiles, homosexuals, and other moral deviants. So he appeared to be pushed out of the group of only self-sufficient people in the form of enemies of the society, that is, the victims. The very first thing he did was he being the start of it, and it was just an irritation up to this point. But for him soon, it became the substance and reflection of that historical moment, as was recorded, that he was involved in a long list of crimes that were mostly, if not all, political beliefs, more than opinions. Gradually, he managed to make his friends participate in the act initially. The philosophy of giving fair treatment that he talked about was popular, and more people started to believe and follow him and his message. Having slow step-by-step talks were his tools to relate with others and bring them over to his side. And he saw it as an effect on his side that was beyond change. The main idea was that a part of his life would be a way for people to feel that they belonged to a group or family. And that is the true meaning of the whole thing. Sustainability was at the heart of people like Mark Hayden, Robert Wagner, and James Focus, and thus these men became a partner in the Bunting, who was framed as a moral crusader, but was actually a series of murders instigated by greed, control, and prejudice. The killing spree started in August of. Bunting played a scene that he scripted where he invited Clinton Douglas Trace to his apartment. Bunting intended to have him be the person he killed in front of the witnesses. Durack, who then used a shovel to cause the man to suffer, and was later on beaten to death. And finally, in August 1997, traces in the Australian television show The Most Wanted. Bunting watched an episode. She watched the show with Vasis, and her mother-in-law mentioned that it all was because of him. Bunting aimed the gun at 26-year-old Ray Davies because on the 20th of January 1993, he took up a relationship with an ex-girlfriend of Bunty named Suzanne Allen, who was known by then as a normal person turned disabled. He was accused of being over the top toward Allen's grandchildren, that the accusations were unsupported. The length of the relationship of about 8 years, the 28th of August 1995, between Suzanne Allen and Ray Davies, was kind of too near to be a mere coincidence of tragic events. But to Bunting, it was a simple agreement between two people on Boxing Day 1995. Bunting and her mother-in-law were warning the camp of the removal of the things from Davy's house, and his mother, instead, got so surprised that he could be on the left part of the things that he told her that he had known his wife's and mom's joining in the slaying of Ray Davies on the Christmas day. They had knifed him. The group went for an unusual trip to a house in the town of Baccara. It was in this house where the victim was thrown into a bathtub and tortured. He was still alive but was in the unconscious state. Them shouting at each other at the table, relaying their initial aim to kill the victim that was extracting money from him, was to make him tell his bank details. He was guaranteed such a life if he did so. But it was all in vain once the group had spent the money he had had in his bank account. The same sexual mangle tool was the one they used to kill him thus. In the aftermath, he was cursed never again in his life because he was responsible for throwing a 200,000 people death party to join the hackers who were mainly from the police department, among whom was Suzanne Allen, who was Davies, and quote, as 50-year-old girlfriend, by shooting his brains out, by beating him to death very brutally. Bunting said that she was the inmate of a death sentence for her links with Raymond Davis. What was not the correct information was that Bunting didn't love her, and he only liked her money, and there is some controversy surrounding her death because she was found in May 1999 wrapped in the plastic and buried on Bunting's enemy, Oppo's property. The ending of this story is that Allen was most likely not the victim of Bunting's crimes, which also included fraudulent cashing of Allen's partly pension to the tune of $177,000, who were the main suspects in the fraud case, and Allen was the likely batterer in this case. The trial that never occurred due to one of the mentioned reasons where the guilty ones were tried or as a result of the jury, the perpetrators weren't convicted, and thereby, her case has not been tried again. This was later narrowed down to Michael Gardner, who only turned 19 at the time, and whose relation to the actor was being the cousin of Wagner's wife. He was supposed to help the police shed light over the cross-dressing issue that was going on in October of 1997, and which had obviously been going on because he was describing Bunting as well, and he had probably seen him as a woman over the house's corner while Wagner's children were playing. He then took the kid's arm and made a gesture to the child. Michael Gardner, a key figure, was described by Bunting and his wife's daughter as the man who had been a man dressed as a woman, speaking of which the neighbors would laugh at. In this case, Bunting's method of addressing the dispute was pretty simple. To deliver it in the crudest way possible, boys would resort to gestures such as the vulgar one of crossing the fingers, which presented a rather funny look to those who had met them before, and could cause teacher Bunting to start feeling uneasy about his shame. But for once, his friend's older brother seemed to be the one who was high on short-term points of his own deed. In one instance of being unaware of his object, he violated Bunting in order to befriend him. In that situation, Bunting and Robert Wagner kept talking about how they would kill Gardner, and this was a very serious conversation too. Most of the time, children use filth or vulgar language to hurt someone on purpose, and in the case of error, inadvertently, since they are not really aware of what they are saying and what it means. Thus, it looks like Gardner seriously must have taken one of the kids and made them say something disgusting or vulgar to them. Later, he probably was trying to explain the wrongness to them with a simple concept that was easily understood, but it was more like he was sending a message through his physical actions then. At the same time, the vulgar joke was also the sign of the cross to Bunting, despite the fact that the sight was so decisive that now Bunting was suddenly faced incest, his own carnal violation, at the hands of his brother's older friend. And this was the moment when the two murderers decided to kill him through a very serious talk. Gardner was driven to a place known as Murray Bridge at the outset. Later, he was carried to a garden shed where he was strangled and subsequently released every time he came close to passing out due to suffocation. In the beginning, Bunting and Wagner were choking him till he got into unconsciousness. In the last time, they stopped for a moment to let Gardner be gone and forget what they had done. The third time that Gardner passed out, he was choked by both of Bunting's hands completely for the first time. The following time around, Gardner died, alas. Then they went and did some damage to his apartment by stealing some artifacts. In this part of the story presents Bunting's serpent and thief who did hide the host's goods. On the other side, Bunting could look like very calm to calm a dog, but really, he was telling the woman that she should not tell lies to the police and help them when they need it. Gardner, in his last life, talks to God and expresses his desire to change. Gardner was changing from a bad to a worse state, and he cut his own face with his nails. Before his 42-year-old ex-girlfriend Vanessa Lane was out, she deliberately had joined the Shrine of John. She told that he was very open to her and told her the whole plans he had for her. And he was more than happy to find out that all his friends named her not as a death threat, but as the second transporter of the valuables from the other peoples that exist on the edge of danger. Of course, Lane should also mention that in addition to the seniors, she took his knowledge and skills relevant for the youth in the community. The only thing that made her feel more comfortable was starting a career on the youth's social media platform, something she was already good at. Though she was the one who got away from the gang by herself, her family also placed her on the shelf. John, nevertheless, considered the like-minded girl not a suitable model for his daughter, and thus, the father might feel sorry for the woman, while the daughter, the one who is exposed, can barely get out. Thus, it was Ito Toltz's end that seemed inevitable. Furthermore, although she also informed the police that Ito was also there, lodged the case against Ito Toltz's police statement. Ito's testimonies are incredibly contradictory because he says he had given some new details to the police, but on the other hand, he recollects verbatim what he said before. In conclusion, I would also like to stress that the law was the one that acted unjustly here. No one ever could find her out. Insects of the cabbage tree, Cordyline australis, have been occasionally found murdered up by Crescent Up Slope Thomas Trevelyan, a local lunatic that stalks the streets and dogs with a kitchen knife. This means that people behaved so bizarrely that you could not trust them on your party on the times after, and even on reuniting the first one. Number 0, DAH Swomond. Still, the questions that Bunting asked were hardly answered. The fall of the man, Thomas Trevelyan, became inartistic since after talking to Bunting, he did some of the accidents in the forthcoming and he felt terrible. Bunting, the Trillion Generation. The town of Kersbrook have the atrocity James Velas, the 1993 killings. Shortly after that, Trillion Dead was discovered to have hanged himself through the noose in Humbug Scrub, James' 29 years old friend who burst into the next case. Porter Gavin, that was known by his mother to be having the fake schizophrenia, was suffering psychically over his mother's keen move from Victoria to South Australia to be metropolitan in the 1997 year Porter. Many times he and his cousin Velas were also drug addicts who were hated by the society, and they were called the stinking pieces of meat among Bunting's murderers at a crime scene. And, sure enough, Velas was also part of the case of his death, but this fact is nowhere to be seen in the paragraph. When he was attacked by Bunting and Wagner, who were trying to get rid of him, was found dead in his car that was parked on the real estate of Bunting for a few days. Vassis had shown that he came to his end by a gunshot. It is assumed that the Porter murder was the first of the batch of haunting stories of the group. He is extremely violent at the beginning of the story. At present, there are things happening, in particular, the criminal world going on around him. That is absolutely going on. This is a very interesting and relevant quote for the story. People have to disenchant from themselves in order to know the world. The writer of this quote also wants to show that he is more of an individual than of David Cronenberg, which makes him the protagonist of the story. The greatest amount of bread skewers that were there hanging from a video proved that the Bunting group did commit such crimes. The guys who placed the bets remember that the same three partnerships in particular, and especially placed the first bet on which group was going to be the first in line. Bunting's group, as well as the bassists of Nicole Wright, including Graco and Roger Hickey bands. The only ones that weren't participating were the Clown Group and the Maltese Band. But there were still members of those two groups who made agreements, being quite famous, combining it with their communication skills, discovering the names, address, and contact numbers of these people who seldom have friends among them. But the ones who partake in these events, in most cases, are key to finding out more of those people, were the time he talked to these people, who were actually clowns in the band and the remaining members of the Melbourne Club. The outcome is something that the doctor said would have been logical because it was just poor nature of hygiene, which was actually the truth behind the craze. Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson both had to smoke for a while, and the forced laughter was just a means of distracting the Queen. However, it was an accident caused by the beginning of the party that was immediately treated, and the laughing chorus Mr. B. Gladiator took the baton and led the savage monster, the clown who normally couldn't stop. I am not a psychiatrist, but I can observe that he was fatigued not at all. It was him being humiliated by the spectators, something he had taken to laughter from no longer sadness. So the other audience members received only the grotesque humor, which was all the same. This Mackey's tribe was explained by Mr. B. Loyal cannot fail the spit-pinting, because it is most threatened when Gary Odo is in the picture. The next victim is often a person who is innocent, that the main trait of the one who commits the evil is the choice of the victim. In the case of 29-year-old Father Odo, who had no means at all to save or rescue his daughter, when the criminals who brought the peace in his life and his siblings' life went further and initiated a zero-tolerance policy in the alleys of Innisiri, where there are sins of cruelty. The woman was found at home where she was left alone, until John Bunting and Robert Wagner came up and opened their way inside the house, only to hear noise coming from inside. Later, her husband got her remains, and he just % smiled and told how to hide her body. From all the mentioned people who the group snatched, it was James Velasquez's stepbrother, 24-year-old David Johnson, who was the main target. Bunting was constantly all over Johnson, and he used derogatory remarks in regard to his personal hygiene and public appearances. Johnson was hoodwinked on the 39th of May of 1999 to drive to him through the deserted Snowtown Bank so that they would buy a used, cheap computer. Once they entered the building, he became trapped, and later on, he was murdered. Bunting and Wagner also cut off his flesh and cooked it for their future feasting. Wagner was also one who had, on some occasions, Bunting's help in. The main reason that it is so easy for anyone to miss the victims is that most of their disappearances were and still are not quickly noticed. However, as a few people started to disappear strangely, some began to think like, why not? Which was indeed the fact. Finally, the case was solved after Velasquez, a young member of the group, was the person who confirmed to police his activities during the commission of the crimes. The drug offender was most likely to be the one arrested out of the 5 who committed the crime streams like theft or drugs possession. It is entirely possible to recuperate from an addiction when the circumstances are in one's favor. Those kids gave it a try to raise some needed funds during the winter. Unable to get any work, they resorted to stealing with violence, which they considered the easiest and quickest way to make a bit of money in those days. The man told all the information about the murders and the mob's strategy, which made it possible for the detectives to gather the necessary information to subsequently solve all the cases committed. The police were lucky to track them through surveillance. One of the most gruesome things inside a plastic disposal barrel was found after the first container in Snowtown. Bunting was a person who came from society and then later withdrew himself from society due to his actions against humans. He had been convicted in both instances as a member of the gang and was charged with multiple murders apart from Lester and Wagner, who were also members of the gang and were sentenced to life imprisonment irrespective of the opportunity. Parole. James Velasquez, who was charged for lesser time, faced a lifetime sentence for at least 26 years, even after he had helped the police. Mark Hayden, who was convicted of having a small part in this occurrence, got a sentence to assist the disposal of bodies of 25 years. The Snowshoe Gangsters had the trial of the band of Twisted Dynamics Disorder, and Bunting was really a sociopath, showing true betrayal using people, and moreover, the development of cult-like devotion among his followers. The judges told the stories of the 4 victims of the group, and that the perpetrators' greed was their demise. Therefore, they deserved imprisonment, detraining, and were désobliged murderers, and also their greed for wealth. The disaster happened at the same time that the truth of the murders was revealed, since that place murders happened. Snowtown was already worrying for an interval, but the community of people from Friary and Sungai appealed to bear, adding the Twangies and joining the fight with protests Woodville and Charleroi, 100 people from both ethnic groups. Snowtown was initially known mainly for its agricultural side privacy. However, the town started getting ridiculed for the crimes that had been committed there so much that it was almost unbearable for the community to live there. Thus, the people in the community had their share of the bad name, on which they were not happy, and thus they decided to go for the change of name when the appropriate time came. The new name now is Little Snowtown, and it was officially adopted, even though people still had the past crimes in mind, though they did not use the name out loud anymore. In addition, it was only limited to Australia, popularly known. It also brought to the surface various aspects of society in which vulnerable people are the right bearers of individual rights. And actually, the issue was much wider than was generally believed. Society came face to face with the fact that bigotry mixed with greed and deceit had given birth to the heinous act of the Snowtown murders. The Flannans were attributed to the dark power, the influence or music of 7 other hunters, who are a separate group of islands located hundreds of meters from the mainland of Scotland. These islands do not host a community, are spectral in the extreme being areas of the North Atlantic Ocean, the most indestructible place on Earth, which is the area people cannot approach without private boats, or possibly a small number of tours that are infrequently operated there. Thanks to the small islands around the biggest one, which is Ian Moore, that the number of these seabirds is very high, and this species becomes the main attraction for the birdwatchers. The Atlantic puffin, along with the black-legged kittiwake and the European shag, was a bird that for the first time found itself in the vicinity of one of the most puzzling and disturbing mysteries of the 20th century, i.e. the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was made. Flannan Isles Lighthouse, that is built on Ian Moore, said that it was the years of the development of the lighthouse that stood by and led stealthy sailors through the terrible waters of the North Atlantic. One of the most beautiful and accomplished Scottish lighthouse engineers, David Allen Stevenson, was the author of this project during its construction in October 1895, and also the erection process which took place despite the harsh winds and turbulent seas. This construction, which was 75 feet tall, was performed by the engineer Stevenson, and the lighthouse was relatively high, standing in particular against harsh mainland weather that often turned into turbulent seas. This in itself would mark great progress, was concluded. Earlier, the torch was given away following the payment of a huge down payment, but now it is completely operated. This lighthouse is a part of history, and its story is connected with the lightkeepers. These were 3 people who were all Mr. James Duckett, Mr. Thomas Marshall, and Mr. William Ross. Since the winter of the year 1899, Mr. Ross became very ill and could not work at all. He was replaced by Mr. Donald MacArthur, who was the keeper of the lighthouse. He had to keep the light on so that he could check if it was functioning well or not. and he had to also write the weather condition and the signs of natural calamity to be reported to the land authorities. They had been dedicated and punctual in performing their duties for more than a year. However, on the 15th of December 1900, the keepers did the unthinkable and stopped writing entries in the logbooks. 3 days later, on the 18th of December, an American ship coming from Philadelphia to Scotland reported that there was no light at the lighthouse anymore. No action was taken at that time, since the weather would not permit the authorities to move until the 26th of December, when the vessel which brought the first part of the lighthouse for the island finally came. The relatives of the reship mix-up picked up the boat, not sure if the beam was a black hole because of a mechanical, technical problem, or if someone simply made a human error. Eventually, when they arrived at the spot, their boat was tied at about 100 m, and after that, they saw that no one was there. The outer doors and the main doors were closed, and the beds were still unmade. The clocks were not even set correctly. All the kitchen items were ready, and there was proof that they had eaten breakfast, but it was remarked that one raincoat was missing. This suggested the possibility of a certain keeper being out of the station, at least. There were no indications of any fights or any use of force, however. The place was very quiet, and still, the missing items were in plain sight. Over the years, the mystery of the story of the lighthouse keepers has been discussed in a of forums, obviously. The event itself was the one the lead protagonists were the most in control of the causes leading to during the investigation of the incident. The theory, however, was that the keepers were struck by a broken wave, that the mob may have seen bringers tears of the gods of the sea to the shore, with the whales thus the original cry of entering a new age of computers that were taken during the heaviness and of the tingling of the tang the ambient, and while the calamity did the elements of a few admittedly fell, entangled the tsunamis on Netflix, were the only ones that sank some of the ships there. But no one thinks the phenomenon of rogue waves is too familiar. The beginner's park is where people first learn how. The reason all the bad accidents happen there would be the first launching. The west approach, of course, is on the other end of the spectrum of danger and uncertainty. So the concomitant of the first part of this story is they all knew what was going on, while the latter was semi-conscious. Yet the pilot has found large twisted railings and removed pulling stones, which gave the evidence of a storm happening, but it wasn't the case. On the other hand, the lighthouse equipment might be defective. Human error could be assigned, or it might be viewed as bad weather that played a role in this event. There were also other reasons for their sudden disappearance. One such wave or storm could have been a major reason for this, which might have been limited to a place near the lighthouse. This one way to explain the sad fate of the poor lighthouse keepers, who in all probability could have been taken by a great wave or a furious storm. Another explanation was that one of the keepers had had a crisis of a very disturbing and probably dangerous kind. Therefore, the aftermath of the lighthouse was a disaster as a result of a bully who added more lamps to the lighthouse because all the other people who were with him had died. One by one, it was probably what had provoked the lighthouse keepers, although it was found to be problem 2. Clinton started the fight. Mostly, it could have also been the absence of the social context that could have lifted the mood that made it a little bit light between the groups, and botched communication could have led to tensions, consequently, violence. But of course, neither the lighthouse nor the light structure could afford any damages or marring that may have been caused by epileptic seizures that would have led to some banging. Hence, this theory may be less believable if conflict was not fought inside the lighthouse by the time, so the remainder of the shreds of evidence might have been washed away through the sea. In this story, the lonely past of Flan and the Isles, which were once a place for offering to pagan gods, have only contributed to the ghost restitution theories. As per native people's hearsay, there is truth to this. They say that spirits alongside that of storm So-called fairy storms, which were likely what had occurred, whisked the men away, but this story is folklore and not a fact. Yet, this story has been popularized in various cultural presentations, such as poems and songs. Besides the stories revolving around the sea monsters and ancient deities, the Flann and Isle have been the topics of the richest myth and folklore backgrounds. These stories would often enhance the mystery's allure. Then again, they would not have a credible explanation for those who are rational and pragmatic. One of the more unlikely theories is the abduction by foreign agents, or the keepers choosing to escape their secluded lives, were the factors involved. However, some of the theories only contain speculations, not based on the available information. Such arguments purport of an alien event, but they are not founded. Such fictional tales denying kidnapping is also ridiculous and not practical to cold-blooded logic. Still, the intention has not been discovered, and the plotters' faces are wrapped in silence, although the lighthouse keepers are still held accountable in fictional accounts. It's very much more likely that the lighthouse keeper was around to do some checking on the supplies, or to shut the door. Afterward, a couple of his friends possibly observed or listened, hearing him, by holding on to one of the few ropes. They decided to be more awed by the scene. Thus, they would initially try to convince him not to take that risk, and if he did, they would be tensed, and then jump into the water to start the rescue of their friend, who was drowning distressingly. In that case, at the demise of their friend, they would also die on the windlass itself. On the one hand, despite them having been exposed to it, it could happen even flatly wrist-waving. Tellingly, the possibility of slipping from the railing during the surge caused by heavy waves is there. There is a danger that could also happen. The potential danger could originate from the part of the material that was placed on the railing. The reference might be the tragedy of the 3 lighthouse keepers, who most probably lost their lives because they preferred sightseeing, so who could not take care of the duties of lighting the lamp. It was this very fact that the Northern Lighthouses of Scotland and the Lighthouse Authority confirmed in its report, which, after a very thorough investigation, let it be known that they had never seen the men, and later dismissed the supposition that they had been washed away and drowned at sea as a result of the raging violent storm. But the remains could not be found, and the families of the lost men were sad. He also disclosed his obsession with the vanishing of the men and the fact that he could not come up with any explanation for it. He was like a brother to them. In fact, the first misfortune that came to his mind was an event that was so unexpected. Although many colleagues of the upper whore of the elite were engaging him, a few officers were chanting to him like the inquisitional members, throwing the rumors about a cover-up and bringing the ignorance of the insensitivity of the signal lights to the agenda. Likewise, it was being discussed that this kind of equipment could be supplemented with high-speed radio and telephone services that are of better quality and have more capability. Thus, only genuine alarms will be used for emergency signals. The topics that have not been answered correctly have been put into a lot of writing and filmmaking, but the main issues have been pushing the boundaries of in the lighthouse operations. Besides the frequent outburst of old protocols, gadgets including weather confirmation and safety signal systems were plugged in and worked in partnership. The trio of men who were lost, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, are still a hot topic of conversation and a mystery even today. More than 100 years after the event, it has become one of the strongest signals of the danger and isolation that those who guard the sea face, the ones who, despite a personal comfort, work so hard to ensure that all of us, including those who are plotting your death, are safely taken care of. The other people, greetings. I hope you enjoyed my spooky story sharing, and stuff. Do not disturb me when I am at my job. Be good, and turn on the notification bell for me to alert you to all future narrations.